my background is auditing. So here at Rutgers, I teach auditing, and my research interest is aligned with what I teach. And so most of the research that I do is in the auditing space. So I'm really interested in the judgment and decision making of auditors. And so as a result of that, my research is grounded more using psych theory. So when I graduated, when I was in my program at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, you know, we had a number of different research seminars that we had to take, and actually research and experimental was one of them. Plus I took classes in the psychology department and a lot of classes in the psych department so that I could prepare myself both to run experiments, like I took stat courses there, as well as some research seminars so I can get more grounded in the literature. And that helped me think through you know, the questions that I had. So most of my questions are focused on how different contextual matters, environmental, psychological characteristics of auditors, how that impacts their judgment and decision making. And so, as you know, auditing is a huge part of accounting. When we talk about the big four firms, we're talking about audit firms, right? So audit is extremely important in accounting, which is why you have to take it if you major in accounting. And so auditors matter, and how they make decisions impact audit quality, which then impacts financial reporting quality. So let me just talk a little bit about what we mean by experimental accounting research. And I just want to say as well that it's not only experimental research in accounting does not only consist of audit research, but also financial accounting research as well. And some of you are AIS students, so you also know that there are components of AIS research that involves experimental research, which I will talk about, I think, in March after the break in the AIS survey course. So I'll talk about a little bit more about that from an AIS perspective in that class, so I won't focus on that here today. So when we talk about experimental research, right, so basically with experimental research, what we're interested in is in my case, auditors. So we get participants and we examine the judgments and decisions, or decide the judgments and decisions of those participants in a control setting. So if you realize, so for example, auditors are an integral part of the capital market system, right? So when financial statements are issued, especially for publicly held companies, what we don't know, what we can't disentangle, is the role that the auditor played in the numbers that were released to the public, right? Because management prepares the financial statements, auditors audit the assertions that management is making about the amounts that are reported in the financial statements. So we know that there's this negotiation process that happens. There's been research, that's my research, as well as a number of other audit researchers that look at that negotiation process. So a controlled environment allows you the ability to disentangle some of the observations that we see in the final reported number. So that's an example of what I mean by controlled. So we are interested in, what we do is we construct the research setting. So for example, and again, you came in late, I know you heard this already, so, because I know you were in the class last Friday. So in the research setting like we have here, we look at variables of interest, right? So for example, with my dissertation, I was interested, the research setting that I was interested in was the negotiation between auditors and clients in resolving difficult, complex accounting issues. So the issue that I chose was a revenue issue. So I created a case, and in this case, used a case from a published study where there was a revenue issue that auditors and managers had to resolve, to agree on, to come to a correct number. So what I was interested in, and actually the case that I used was drawn from a real audit engagement. So what I was interested in is what factors, some of the factors, that would influence that decision, would influence auditors' judgments. And so two of the things that I looked at a lot of things, but two things I looked at in the published paper is the IVs that I manipulated engagement risk. And engagement risk is an important component of the audit environment. And so there's been studies that said, auditors, when engagement risk is high, they tend to be more conservative, right? And that makes sense. Intuitively that makes sense because they have a lot more to lose, right? So they tend to resist the client, the client's attempt to report aggressively. And then, so I said a situation where there was high engagement risk or moderate engagement risk and low engagement risk. And so I use different proxies for engagement risk that's been examined and validated in research. Then I also measured the auditor's negotiation experience, what we call task experience. And my thought process was that auditors, right, those are two key factors that could influence how the auditor will behave in a negotiation, how it will impact their negotiation approach, and then because of that approach that they use, how it impacts the outcome. Right? And so when I looked at this, it was an emerging area of research on auditor-client negotiation, because people, there was this thought that, there is no negotiation, but there are, because we have contentious accounting issues, right? GAAP is not black or white. There are a number of standards in GAAP that require a significant amount of judgment and is very subjective. And so I was interested in those situations because those were the situations where negotiations between the client and the manager and the auditor were most likely to happen. So that's the idea of manipulating, right? Because I was trying to isolate, I was interested in how these two contextual factors, engagement risk and the auditor's experience or the auditor's capabilities, how that could influence the negotiation process and ultimately the outcome that's reported in the financial statements. So one of my variables I manipulated and another variable I measured in my experimental instrument. Because you can't manipulate a negotiation experience, right? I can't say, okay, you really have low negotiation experience versus you really have high negotiation experience. I can't manipulate that, right? It has to be, it's what the auditor or the participant possess, right? So if I tell them they have low negotiation experience, well, in actuality, they're really good at negotiation, then my experiment is going to fail, right? Because I have to take into account the fact that the auditor, those are the types of things that I can't manipulate. Just like I can't manipulate gender. Either you're a male or a female. I can't tell you, okay, you're a male, pretend you're a female. Because what does that mean to you? Right? That might mean different things to different people. So it would make more sense to measure it. Then you control for potentially influencing variables, right? So you have, and you see this when you're doing archival research, you have tons of control variables because you can't account for everything, right? So you want to make sure that those variables that could potentially influence your results, that you're controlling for those. So things that I control for would be industry expertise. Some negotiations, gender matters. So I control for things like that, the rank, whether it was a partner or a manager. I also control for whether the person was certified or not. And in most of my cases, they were, whether they had a graduate degree or merely undergraduate degree education. So those kinds of things have been shown to matter. And then looked at any type of intervening or mediating variables. So one of the things that I looked at in this context was client pressure. And so client pressure was something that I measured. I measured based on questions that I asked the auditors or my participants in this case in order to simulate client pressure. So thinking about experiments, the important thing is control, right? you want to make sure that you have good control, because you want to be able to make strong inferences. You want to be able to say that the IV, the independent variables that you measured or manipulated, were the cause of the change in the dependent variable. So I had to know, right? I had to be able to concretely say, right, control it so that I knew that the engagement risk and negotiation task experience impacted or led to a difference, right, in outcome and the process. So that was really important because I want to be able to generalize. The other thing is, because I do audit research, I'm interested in extracting from practice. I don't want to do something that auditors don't do. Right? If it's not important in an audit context, it's not realistic. So I draw from practice. So most of my research ideas comes from obviously reading the most recent audit research, attending conferences, but also being engaged in practice. So a lot of things I know just because I'm an auditor by training. Right? That's what I did for the first half of my professional life. I was an auditor. So a lot of things are just intuitive to me. Right? But I have to think about that as well, because how much of what's intuitive to me is formed by my own biases. Right? So I have to think through that. So it's good to stay engaged in practice about what's really going on, to look at different viewpoints about how things are occurring. So, for example, KPMG has a faculty symposium, and most of the firms do, but I tend to get invited to the KPMGs. And so while there, they were talking about data analytics. And so I have a paper now that I worked on, developed with two co-authors, one at Wisconsin and the other at Bentley, where we thought the same thing, both coming from an audit background. What's the impact of audit analytics on audit expectation, the expectations gap? How would it influence the auditor's opinion? So we, based on that, developed a study that we've used. Now we didn't use auditors in that sense, so we developed a study to look at that. So again, that's something current that is happening in the profession that has an impact on, that potentially we found does have an impact, right? Will have an impact on how users of the financial statements view the use of audit analytics, right? Does it increase the expectation gap or not? And the important thing is to identify theory to support your hypotheses. And this is not unusual, right? This is what you do regardless of the type of or method of research that you do. Theory has to drive your hypotheses. And so, as I said before, for experimental research, we draw from any number of different theories. So mostly when you're talking about, because I do judgment and decision making, most of my research my theory comes from psych, where I'm using psych theory to explain my expectations about how an individual, an auditor, or an investor is going to behave in a particular context. One of the classes that I had to also take was, we took a research class that was grounded in sociology, in theory, in organizational theory. Right? So you'll see you'll see a lot of that research in that area. You tend to see that published in AOS or Administrative Science Quarterly. So it really deals with management theory as it's relevant to individual behavior in a social setting, as well as economic theory. So you'll see that used in experimental research drawing on financial accounting and, as I said, sociology. So again, theory is important regardless of your method, but those are just some of it. So you can see that experimental research is not just focused on using psych theory. You can use theory from other disciplines because it's your question, right? What's your research question? And you have to ground that in theory. So some of the strengths of experimental research is that there's a high level of certainty with changes in the outcome of interest because you're controlling. So by controlling the study, you know, and through random assignment, right? So I don't say to individuals, you go in this box and you go in this box. So I will randomly assign them to the condition that one of the conditions. And so with my negotiation experiment that I did, I had someone program a simulated client. So my auditor participants, which consisted of partners and managers, would log on to the website or program, and the program was, you know, set up so that they would be randomly, just, you know, directed randomly to each of the conditions, one of the 4 conditions. So it's easy to do to have random assignment. If you use MTurk, Qualtrics, you can do that. You can set it in Qualtrics where your instrument will, your survey will automatically randomize your participants. And so that's really important. So you're controlling, you're not directing people in any one condition. So you send them to, randomize them to the manipulated conditions, and obviously measured, you can't, right? Measured, they are in the condition that they're in. Right? If they're female, they're female. You can't say, okay, I'm gonna randomly send you over to the male box. Right? So those are measures a little different, but you try to get, make sure that you have at least a representative sample of men and women, for example, in each condition. And also, when you think about research studies that's using the experimental design, you can replicate it more than once. You can, because especially you're drawing on this theory, you have this context, and you have to think about, so there's tons since I've graduated, since my dissertation, there's tons of research on auditor-client negotiations because it's such a multifaceted area, and there's so many different variables that could impact how auditors behave in a negotiation. And so there's been a number of studies looking at the client's role in negotiations, looking at, I have another study that looks at the role of corporate governance in negotiation. In other words, the audit committee, what the impact the audit committee has on the auditor. And we were drawing on the research on power dynamics and negotiations. And so in that case, we drew directly from the general negotiation literature. So there's some weaknesses, obviously, because we're creating an environment. So we try to address this, right, because we're abstracting from a larger environment, and of course there are other things. So let's take, for example, the negotiation. I had my auditors interact with a simulated client. Well, that's not how people negotiate. That's not how auditors negotiate in real life. And also, auditors don't think of it as negotiation. In fact, when I was trying to get subjects for my research, for my dissertation, I kind of got pushback, when I approached the firm representatives, and they're like, well, we don't negotiate with our client on these issues. We interact with them to resolve it. So I was like, fine. You can call it whatever you want to call it. But the fact of the matter is, I knew that's the description of a negotiation, so I called it interaction. That's the same thing. So again, that's not how they normally do it. They sit across the table from their clients and they try to resolve the issue. It could happen over a number of days. The first time the issue arises, they go to the client and then they get more information and they come back and so forth. So we do create this slice, right? So it's not exactly, because we can't. The reality is that's the challenge with audit research, right? I can't observe the auditor in his or her natural setting. Can't do it. I'm not going to be able to see a client and an auditor negotiate for obvious reasons, right? There's client confidentiality. So I have to take slices of that, try to make the context as real as possible, but recognizing that there's some limitations because I cannot create how it actually occurs in a real world setting. So, in the experimental design, the important areas are, selecting your sample of subjects, right? So your sample, the subjects that you select should be able to perform that task. So one of the things, again, staying with my example of my negotiation studies, I used audit partners and managers because those are the individuals who negotiate with the client, who are going to resolve these high-level issues. It's not going to be a first-year auditor. It's not going to be a senior. It's going to be the audit partner or manager. And there's been a study since that saying that it's really going to be more so on audit partners. So there's some disagreement over that, right? So I spoke to representatives from different firms to talk to them about, okay, what happens? So if you're presented with an issue, a difficult financial reporting issue where the client is disputing, or you dispute the client's number, how do you resolve that? Like, what happens? What's the process? So I had to make sure I understood the process. I also read there was a seminal paper that came out on that negotiation between auditors and clients to make sure I understood what really happened. And I asked, and who normally does that? Right? So I made sure I had the right subject pool. So that's going to be really important. If you're using staff auditors, it has to be a task that they're able to perform. Right? And so some people will use students. You have to ask yourself, well, can a student really simulate a proxy for a first-year auditor or a second-year auditor? Do they have the required skill set to perform the task? Because if they don't, then you can't rely on those results because it's not really telling you how a first-year auditor would behave or the decision that a first-year auditor would make. So you have to be very careful about your subjects, and that's the sample of subjects that you select is going to really be driven by the research task, the task that you're looking at, the questions that you're asking. Then you also want to determine whether or not if you're looking at group dynamics, you need to pair subjects. So in my case, I didn't have to pair subjects because I controlled the client on my end by creating a simulated environment. Right? I created a simulated client. So my auditors logged into the program, and it began the discussion about giving them background information. And so once they started the process, the client responded. So it was give and take. And I controlled how the client responded. Right? So that I knew that was the control that I placed over it. So everybody was reacting to the same type of client. Right? I didn't want to have a concessionary client on one end and a contentious client on the other. Right? Everybody, I wanted to make sure that the only thing that I was capturing was the auditor's response to a controlled environment. You have to identify what your control and non-experimental factors are, and that's the control variables, any mediating factors. The important thing about an experiment is the experimental design is the most work up front. Right? Making sure that your experimental instrument is as tight as you could possibly make it, because you don't get any do-overs. Right? And it's expensive to do over. So in my case, I can't just say, okay, man, I forgot something, so I'm going to get 80 more managers and partners and managers. It's not happening. It is the most, and I don't want to burn my audit partners and managers, and it's nothing like that, because they're so difficult to get access to. So it was really important to make sure that I pilot tested my instrument. I really thought through the questions that I was asking. I thought about different demographic variables that might impact my results that would be important to know. I drew on prior research in developing and theory and developing my hypotheses or my research questions to make sure that I was capturing important information, because the one thing you don't want to do, you start writing a paper, or you get your paper, a working paper submitted to a journal, and you get a review comment that says, well, your results have really been driven by X, right? And here's why. And you can't explain that. You can't say, oh, you have a point. So conducting a pilot study and really making sure that you have really sound, a really sound experimental instrument. And I made this observation in this point in the class on Friday, is the study that, the paper that we have now looking at audit data analytics. We probably spent 6 months just, I would say 4 to 6 months just really developing that instrument. We spent probably a month just going back and forth over the manipulation, the 2 variables we manipulated, right? To make sure. Then we had other people who were, senior level people who've done hundreds of experiments to look over our instrument, give us feedback. We pilot tested it about 2 times before. I pilot tested with friends and family, and we pilot tested it on MTurk. So, we wanted to make sure that we had, and we think we do, that we have a really sound instrument now. How many of you have seen the Libby boxes other than the people who were in the class last week? The Libby boxes are really important. I try to train myself to think through, to always use the Libby boxes when I'm thinking, designing a study. Because you want to be able to really think through the theory and how you're measuring. So conceptually would be the theoretical underpinnings of your research, right? Your research question. What's driving that research question? And then the operational is how you're going to proxy, right? How you're going to measure that in your experiment, and then also thinking about the potentially influencing control variables as well as any mediating or moderating variables. And so basically, conceptually, you have a construct, and you're saying, and that's your independent variable. How does that relate to the dependent variable? So in a paper, the paper from which this is drawn, and if you're interested, I could post that, give that to Andrea, and you can get a copy of that paper that talks about the Libby boxes. They give an example of a financial accounting study. And their construct is that they use, the theoretical construct, they're looking at, I think, analysts. And then analysts have incentives. And those incentives are going to influence their recommendations, right? So the independent variable is analyst incentives. So the theory that exists describing analyst incentives, and they believe that that independent variable is going to impact the outcome, which is their recommendations. And then they operationalize that, and I think they had 2 or 3 conditions where describing analyst incentives, which they manipulated, and then the outcome would be their operational for their recommendations would be they measure their forecasts, something like that. I'm trying to recall, right? So again, the theory drove their conception, their construct of the independent variable and how it would influence the dependent variable, and then you have to somehow measure that, and that's the proxy you can. So the Libby boxes are really, really important. I think it's a good way as you're developing, and it's not just related to experimental research, because you still have to think about your concept, right? Your construct and how you're going to measure your independent and dependent variables in any study, whether you're doing archival study or you're doing experimental research. So it's a good way to get you to really think through the development of your study is the Libby boxes. So Andre, if you send me an email, I'll post the paper, the Libby boxes. I'll send it to you, and you can send it to the students. So key things in any experiment is the validity of the experimental design. So internal validity and external validity. And internal validity says, did the experimental treatment, make the difference in this specific instance rather than some extraneous variable? Right? You want to know that the things that you manipulate or measure is what's driving the dependent variable. And we strengthen this by random assignment. And so we're not putting people in a box, we're randomly assigning. Can we conclude that changes in the IV cause the observed changes in the independent variable? And that's going to depend on that's going to drive our conclusions, right? It's going to have an impact on our conclusions. So if we show a high degree of internal validity, then we can show strong evidence of causality. And likewise, if we can't show, then we can't. If we can't show internal validity, or if we have low internal validity, then we can't really make a statement about causality. Again, that's a threat, right? If we have low internal validity, it compromises our confidence in the relationship between the independent and dependent variable. External validity deals with the population, right, and the ecological validity. So how representative is the sample of the population? The more representative, the more confident we can be in generalizing the sample population. So there's no reason for me to expect in my negotiation studies that audit partners and managers at KPMG will react differently than audit partners and managers at Deloitte or at Ernst & Young if they find themselves in a similar situation, right? I had no reason to believe that audit partners in a Big Four versus a regional firm would behave differently. But in any event, I collected that information. So I collected the size of the firm. Obviously, I know which firm is I recruited from, and I, knew which the different firms, and I controlled for that, and there was no difference. Right? It had no impact on my outcome. Right? But that was so I can generalize. Right? I can say that these partners and managers in my study are representative of how I would expect partners and managers to behave when they find themselves in this situation. So I felt as though I could generalize. And then ecological validity is the degree that a result generalizes across settings, right? I was really only interested in this in the sense of in the accounting, right? In an audit, from an audit perspective, when I was interested in how CFOs might approach the same set of facts, then I ran a study using CFOs, right? I didn't say that my audit findings would generalize to CFOs because they have different incentives, right? They have different objectives. So I examined CFOs differently, right? Using a different study. So again, it's important that you can say that your findings are generalizing. So I already talked about, gave an example, I'm going to stop here, just how I use, I just want to show actually, for the study that I was talking about, how I applied the Libby boxes. So as I said, my research question is what effect, and my auditor negotiation clients, and what effect do certain factors on auditor strategies and financial reporting decisions in AC negotiations to resolve complex reporting issues specifically? I looked at auditor engagement, risk, and auditor experience. I also measured using a validated instrument. I measured the auditor's conflict management style. I measured their negotiation tactics. So I had a number of variables that I captured and measured in my experiment. And so overall, what I was interested in was, again, what factors, what are some of the factors that influence the negotiation process and then ultimately the negotiation outcome. So I drew from the general negotiation literature as well as negotiation literature and auditor in the audit research space to think about different types of factors that could influence. Some examples, and these are not all of the things that I captured in my dissertation, but here are some of the examples. Audit firm culture, right? Is it does the partner or manager view their firm as being very pro-client or risk, more focused on risk? Engagement risk was one of the things, again, that's one of the variables I used in the first study. and engagement risk as being high or low, and that's what I manipulated. So I measured audit firm culture on a scale based on prior research, and I manipulated engagement risk as high versus low, or high versus moderate, using prior research. And so, for example, prior research says high engagement risk is generally, and this is in audit firms as well, how they think about engagement risk if it's a publicly held company. If management is very aggressive in terms of reporting. You know, if it's a publicly held company, high analyst following. So all of that increases the auditor's engagement risk. And then for my low engagement risk, it was a non-public company, so forth and so on. Then I looked at psychological factors or characteristics, I should say, of the auditor, such as the auditor's negotiation experience, so we call that task experience, which is what I measured in the first paper. The auditor's overall general experience, so in terms of how many years they've been an auditor, their conflict management style, which I measured based on a validated scale. And what I was interested in was how does it impact the negotiation process? And so variables that I captured to describe the negotiation process was the number of rounds that they went, because the longer the negotiation goes, right, that means there's more back and forth. And I had to cap mine because clearly they couldn't go forever, right? I didn't have the luxury of keeping a partner there for 3 or 4 hours. Would mean that the negotiation is becoming more contentious or distributive, right? So the longer it went meant that auditor was adopting more of a contentious, perhaps contentious behavior. So that gave me some insight into how contentious the process was. The reporting choices made during the process. So as I said, I simulated a client and I programmed the client that they negotiated with so that they would gradually reduce their demands. So they initially started out at a very high number, and then gradually they came down. They would come down. So each round that they went, the client would drop a little bit, change their reporting position a little bit. And so I captured how the auditors responded in that process. At which point in that negotiation process did they agree? And the negotiation end? At what point did the negotiation end? So I was then able to look at the average, number of rounds that they went, as well as the average position or amount that they agreed to. And I also asked them to explain their choices. And this was a little challenging because I wanted to know how they justified the decision that they made, and I wanted to see, because I had it where it capped at 10 rounds, they could go at least 10 rounds. I wanted to see how their decision process or their thought process, judgment, changed over time. Like what triggered them to resolve the issue with the client. Because what I wanted to make sure of is that, and the reason to kind of cap it at 10 was I didn't want them to just say, you know what, I'm tired of this, I'm out. Right? So I wanted to make sure that, and again, by getting them to give me an explanation of their choices, it's almost like them justifying why they arrived at the decision that they did arrive at. And there's been research that shows that when auditors are put in the position of having to justify their positions, they tend to be more skeptical or more conservative because they now have to explain why. And that's a natural setting in the audit context, right? Auditors have to be able to justify their judgments, justify the decisions that they make. So they think about that in arriving at those decisions. And then on the negotiation outcome side, I measured concession. So how much did they move from their original position? What were their initial positions that they chose? And then what was the final outcome? Right? And this is all drawn from the general negotiation literature. So those are just some of the examples, some of the variables that I measured and captured in those two areas. And so as I was interested in this, because at the time that I was in my doctoral program, it was right during the Enron blow up and WorldCom, and so there was, audit firms were under a huge, they were under a huge spotlight. There was a loss of confidence in auditors and the profession, and so I was interested, and also my own personal experience as an auditor. I thought, it's not as simple as the auditors just came in. And at the same time, a seminal paper came out, study was done, which is now one of the seminal papers in auditor-client negotiations, that said, hey, auditors and clients actually do negotiate, and here are the factors that influence that. And this paper interviewed both partners and audit firm people as well as clients to talk about this process, this negotiation process. And so, my position was like, it's not that, maybe it's just that auditors are not that good at it. Right? It's not something if you think about, and I don't know how many of you are undergraduate audit students, but you don't learn negotiation and audit necessarily. Well, I teach it in my class now because it's what I'm interested in, but that's not a part of your curriculum, right? You don't have to take a negotiation class. So it's not something that you learn as you're coming through the ranks in auditing. So, and the other thing, I felt like clients are just better at it because the client is the first mover. It's their financial statements, so they already know what they're going to report, right? They know that, and they're not stupid, they know what they're going to have to defend, right? So they know also what auditors might challenge them on. I have, because I, again, have come from an audit background, an accounting background, most of my friends are at positions now where they are the clients, and a few are audit partners now, but where they're the clients or they've been the audit partners. And so talking to them, they're like, we don't just roll over because the auditor says so. Right? It's not because the auditor comes in and says, this is the number you should book, that we're going to book that number. If we think we have it, we can make the case that our number is right. Right? So we try to, convince them that our number is right. And so to me, it just seemed it was interesting question, is to understand a little bit better the dynamics and what factors influence their dynamics. And also from an audit perspective, how can we provide better insight for auditors in this, when they find themselves in this position. So I thought it was an interesting question. It was an emerging area of research, and so I felt that there was an opportunity to add something, a contribution, make a contribution. So my theory was based on the negotiation research, both from the general negotiation literature as well as from the emerging literature in auditor-client negotiations. And then I drew on literature and theory surrounding engagement risk and auditor experience versus auditor expertise. And this is just an example of my design that I had set up. So when again, I told you it was a simulated client. So auditors logged into I sent them a link, they logged into the system. The system randomly assigned them to a particular condition. They had to, because we're using human beings, we have to make sure that we abide by the IRB, Institutional Research Board's requirements when using human subjects. And that's another thing, if you're going to do an experiment, you have to get approval from whatever university you are affiliated with. And at Rutgers, even as a student, if you do an experiment, you have to go through IRB training, and you have to, and whenever we design a study, we have to first get IRB approval before we can implement that study using human subjects. But it's an annoying process, but a relatively quick process to go through. Right? And it's mandated. So as I said, conflict management style is something that I was interested in that could possibly influence my results. So I used an instrument to measure their conflict management style. And I wanted it at the beginning of the experiment because I wanted it before they had any information about what was going on, right? Before, because I didn't want them to be influenced by how they responded to the client or the experimental context. So I wanted just a pure measure of their conflict management style. So I captured that first. Then after they completed that, they got a description of the client, and my engagement risk manipulation, which is whether it's a publicly held client and all of the factors that I've talked about, or whether or not it was a privately held company, which was the low engagement risk. And then once they got that background, I presented them with the issue, and I gave them the summary of the different, it was a revenue recognition issue. And as I said, this was something that was abstracted from a real audit engagement. So I did have something normative if I needed to look at, but I really wasn't interested in what the right answer is. I was interested more in the negotiation process and how that influenced the negotiation outcome. But I did have a normative measure. And so they had 5 that they could choose from. And then once they reviewed the alternatives, I asked them to rank their preference, right? So in other words, what do you think is your most preferred method? If you could get the client to basically agree to what you want, what's the most preferred method? To rank those from 1 to 5, and then indicate their confidence that each of the alternatives met GAAP, right? So could you justify, how confident are you that you could justify these alternatives under GAAP? Because again, auditors have to justify their decisions. They have to be able to explain, why is this acceptable under GAAP? So once they had that background information and I captured some assessments, then they got into the negotiation with the simulated client. So I asked them, what do you think the likelihood is? I wanted to know because I was trying to capture their perception of client pressure. So I asked them to indicate how likely they would have to persuade the client that their preference is the right preference, is the right answer. Then I asked them to select an alternative and provide a reason. So they had to select from one of these 5. So once they did that, the client responds. The client comes back and says, so I programmed the client so they always wanted the most aggressive position, right? So they wanted to report the highest amount of revenue, which in this case was the straight line method at 531. So always program the client to start there, and gradually the client would come down. So every other round the client would come down. So if the auditor gave in, so if the auditor said the 531 was the right number, then the client would come back and say, great, we agree, the negotiation ended. But if the auditor said 230 was the number, the client would respond, no, 530 is what we think. And I had reasons why the client, so I tried to simulate what the argument that the client would make. And again, I had that power test and it was reasonable to the auditors. So if the client and auditor agree, the negotiation ends. And if the auditor and client disagree, we move back and go through the same process. So I had this, if they didn't do this within 10 rounds, at the 10th round, the client caved. The client gave in and the negotiation ended. And then I collected, remember, you should also think about control variables and potentially mediating variables. And so I asked them to indicate their confidence of each alternative per GAAP. Again, the engagement risk, I had to check that they understood which condition they were in. So you have to always have a question that checks that your manipulation worked, right? And so what I did was I asked them a question about how they would rate engagement risk on a scale of, I think, 1 to 7, explaining what engagement risk was. And so my manipulation worked. So I wanted to see that there was a significant difference between people in the low engagement risk and the high engagement risk, that there was a significant difference, and that people in the low engagement risk assess engagement risk as significantly lower than those people in the high engagement risk condition. And that worked, and the engagement manipulation worked. Then I also, as I said, measured their assessment of their audit firm culture. Then I also asked like what's the number of years, that's the measurement, your task experience of your auditor-client negotiation, what's your rank as are your manager or partner, the number of years of experience you have, as well as your industry. And in this case, it really should not have made a difference with respect to industry, but I collected that anyway because prior research shows that industry matters and could impact auditor judgment. So I collected that, but my task was the issue was a generic enough issue that a partner or manager the industry shouldn't matter in how they approached it or how they understood the issue. So because of that, industry had no impact on my results. Industry didn't matter in this case. So as I put that into my predictive box, as I've thought about this, right? So my independent variable, I had audit contextual features. So features of the audit, including the auditor as well as the audit engagement. So engagement risk representing the risk, audit engagement, fact features, and auditor negotiation experience or task experience representing the auditor contextual characteristics of the auditor. And I said that these features will impact the negotiation process and the negotiation outcome. And then again, my measure of the independent variables, the potential factors of engagement risk, as well as auditor negotiation experience, and my measure of the dependent variables was concessions, the amount of concessions that auditors made, the outcome, the final outcome, because that's the amount that's reported that would be reported in the financial statements, and the auditor's confidence in their position, because that's their final outcome in terms of how they would be able to justify or support that the amount that's reported there. And then I captured, as I said, client pressure as a mediating variable, and measured, captured their general experience, rank, industry, and so forth. So that is how I went from my bigger research question in terms of developing my theory, and to develop my theory and then running my experiment. So I'm going to stop here so we can get to the part of the class where you're going to talk about the papers that you...
All right, I'm going to talk about Professor Brown and Lombardi's paper and using an expert system to Debias the dilution effect and auditor judgment.
So can I just say something real quickly again? This is actually Danielle Lombardi, who was Professor Vasarhelyi's PhD student. So this was from her dissertation. I was on her dissertation committee. And so this is the paper, one of the papers from her dissertation.
So I take the research question to be what factors influence auditors' judgment in the fraud risk assessment process. And then, why is this question important? Because fraud risk assessments are very important to the auditor. So Auditing et al. 1997 in their paper said too weak a response could jeopardize the effectiveness of the audit, and too strong a response could result in an inefficient audit. So I take this to be like, if the fraud risk assessment is too high, then it costs time and money, which is very important to auditors, because we know auditors care a lot about their time and their money. And if
don't we all?
Yeah, exactly. And if the fraud risk assessment is too low, then there's a risk of litigation, and also effectiveness is impaired. So what about the dilution effect? The dilution effect, Waller and Zimbelman, 2003, they give the explanation that judgment is the dilution effect is a judgment bias in which the presence of non-diagnostic cues, when processed along with diagnostic cues, causes the judge to underweigh the diagnostic cues. So the auditors experience the dilution effect when faced with relevant and irrelevant information. This was research done by a lot of authors that I put there, and I won't go over all of them. And additionally, the dilution effect mostly affects inexperienced auditors, and the reason why is less experienced auditors sequentially examine information. Could be. This is a hypothesis suggested by Biggs and Hawk in their 1983 paper. And they found that, others found that less experienced auditors can distinguish between the info they see as irrelevant and the info they see as relevant, but they're still affected. This is some other research done by other authors. And irrelevant information unconsciously affects their judgment. So that's the conclusion, because they can distinguish, but they're still affected. And how does the dilution effect relate to fraud assessments? Well, fraud assessments, authors have done research on fraud risk assessments and the dilution effect. So the dilution effect causes fraud risk assessments to be more conservative, and it happens when irrelevant and relevant info are present. Again.
So can I just make a point? Because when you say that it's more conservative, one might say that, because we expect auditors to be conservative, but in this case, right, it goes to the point of what you said, that is, it impacts efficiency and effectiveness, right? Because if it's too conservative, if an auditor's judgment is too conservative here, then that means that they're spending resources on an area where the risk is not high, and those resources could be spent on other areas where risk is higher.
And finally, there's research on the dilution effect and how it just affects auditors in general and how they go about their audit. So Glover 1997 finds that time pressure reduces dilution effect, but it's not a very significant effect at all. Accountability has no effect on the dilution effect. Like, it doesn't make it if auditors are held more accountable, it doesn't make the dilution effect more serious, and it doesn't make it less serious either. So there's also research on decision aids and the dilution effect. The checklist actually exacerbates the dilution effect, and simple checklists are ineffective and results in lower quality decision making, so it's not really a solution for the dilution effect either. Decision aids also, in general, the prior literature on decision aids says decision aids increase level of accuracy of risk assessments. They increase less experienced auditors' judgment effectiveness, and when used, they're used more when the complexity of the task is greater. So we do see this parallel as in the dilution of when we have the dilution effect, it seems like decision aids don't really help it, but we do have a lot of other research with auditors and decision aids that says it really helps. So one of the goals of this research is basically to resolve that. So then we come to the actual research questions. I separate into, I guess, kind of 3 steps. So the first step is, does the dilution effect affect fraud risk assessments specifically, and when does it take effect? And are there ways to mitigate it, which would be addressed by looking at the decision aids in that area. So, and then the hypotheses. The hypotheses, the H1 is on relevant and irrelevant information. The authors want to test their H1, which is less experienced auditors in an environment with both relevant and irrelevant information will make fraud risk assessments quantitatively different from those made by less experienced auditors in an environment with relevant information only. So here the auditors are testing the condition of relevant information only versus relevant and irrelevant information.
So can I say, I want to answer this. So this hypothesis, right, is we're not learning anything new, right, and with H1. And because we already know, based on prior research, that auditors are impacted, less experienced auditors are subjected to, are prone to the dilution effect. We already know that. Prior research has told us that. But the importance in this, in establishing H1, is we need to establish that the dilution effect actually occurred. So we need to show that the dilution effect occurred before we can say that the expert system mitigated it. Right? So it's important to establish that hypothesis up front, to show it exists so we can show that it was indeed mitigated by the expert system. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to show that, right? It's a within subject experience. If we don't show that the dilution effect occurred, we can't reliably say that the expert system mitigated it. So that's an important point about H1.
And then there was prior research that showed expert systems takes the auditor through the decision-making process, forcing auditor to justify and possibly adjust assessments. So then the question comes, will the expert system actually help in this fraud risk assessment process? It shows, so the research before I think shows that auditor learning does occur. So I think the H2 is testing if the expert system helps and also auditor learning. So the H2 stated officially is if less experienced auditors in an environment with both relevant and irrelevant information using an expert system as a decision aid will make fraud risk assessments that are closer to those made by the expert panel of experienced auditors than assessments made prior to using the expert system. And finally, the third hypothesis is the reference to prior research is that decision aids can restructure auditors' tasks of making judgments. So here, I highlighted the last part because that was what was different from the H2. It's that H3 is testing if less experienced auditors in an environment with both relevant and irrelevant information using the expert system as a decision aid will make fraud risk assessments that are closer to those made by less experienced auditors in an environment with only relevant information with no expert system. So I think the auditors stated later in their table, which I think was very informative, that the H3 is an interaction between the relevant condition and the expert system condition. So how is the study actually set up? The authors used 46 audit seniors with mean 4.2 years of experience. So 12 participated in the verbal protocol analysis, and the mean fraud risk assessments they completed in the last 3 years is about 8.13. Actually, I have a question at the end. Why did you choose audit seniors? Because you could have chosen like staff as well, right? Are you assuming that staff doesn't really make fraud risk assessments?
Right, that's not what they're going to do. So if we, because fraud risk assessments are complex, right? So usually, and this is just based on practice. Again, Danielle also is a CPA and was an auditor in her prior life, and so based on her experience in talking to practitioners, they confirmed what we both perceive is that these are not assessments that are generally made at the staff level. They're going to be made at the senior level. So it's a task fit. So it's important to make sure that there's a person task fit, that their level of experience will allow them to to be able to perform this task. And so audit seniors are most qualified to do. And it's audit seniors because anything higher than that, it's only at that level, audit seniors and below, where this dilution effect would occur, right?
Okay.
So.
Right. And I grouped this all under expert system, but actually the panel should just be the experienced panel. Mm-hmm. This is used to create actually the comparison between what the participants we want to test, their fraud risk assessments, and the expert panel's fraud risk assessments. So the expert panel is consisted of 20 managers and partners. So 10 of them had the case where there was only relevant information, and 10 had the case with relevant and irrelevant information. And their overall fraud risk assessment was 3.085. And the authors did a test to make sure, of course, there was no significant difference between cases, which shows that they are the ones who, they're experienced and they won't be subject to the dilution effect.
Right. It was important to show that the dilution effect is not occurring in more experienced people.
And then the Audex is actually the expert system. They're developed by Lombardi and Dole 2014. It's an artificial intelligence tool. It only gave individual item fraud assessment ranges, no overall score. This becomes important a little bit later, which I will explain in the design. And it uses parts of SAS 99, which is actually, I think, the guidelines for fraud assessment. So the dependent variable here, we have overall assessed level of fraud risk. It's rated on a 1 to 7 Likert scale, with 7 being extremely high and of course 1 being extremely low. The independent variable is the expert system. There's one independent variable because it's a 2x2 design study. So the first one is the expert system within subjects, and the other is the relevant and irrelevant information, or relevant versus relevant and irrelevant information condition. So I just took this from the author's their appendix because I thought it explained it really well. So the first step is they sign the human subjects form and log into the website. The second step, they read the case information. The participants read the case information. They make their initial fraud risk assessment based solely on the case information. And then they list and rate the level of importance for each factor considered in determining the initial fraud risk assessment. If it's not considered, then they just go on to the next factor. But if it's considered, then they rate the level of importance there's, I think, 7 in all. And then they rate how important it is to developing their overall risk assessment, which is the dependent variable that we really wanted to capture here.
Right, and the fraud risk factors were based on SAS 99, because that's what auditors, that's the guideline that they should be using.
So I wanted to go over specifically the design of the expert system because, as Professor Brown mentioned, this is a major contribution of this paper to the literature. So the fraud cues questions are similar to the SAS 99 checklist. The comparison of individuals and systems assessment of fraud risk indicator. All right, so it's either, this is part of actually the design itself. There's a comparison of the, let me read this comparison. Oh, right, so this was a number of the information cues, I think, that was in the paper. So it was either 6 for the relevant condition and 10 for the relevant and irrelevant condition, which shows, because we showed that the dilution effect occurs in less experienced auditors when they're faced with basically an information overload. So it tests between the 6, which is the less information and only relevant information, and the 10, which has the relevant and irrelevant information. And it states, the expert system states the system's rationale and the sources for what assessment level they make for the 6 or 10, but it doesn't actually give the overall fraud risk assessment, which is why, which makes the design of the experiment stronger. And it reminds participants at the end of the initial assessment and asks them to submit their final overall fraud risk assessment with justification. So these are the preliminary results. It shows that, we see here the mean. So the expert panel has the lowest mean. The no expert system, only relevant information, the mean is, we'll compare to the relevant and irrelevant information. We show that relevant and irrelevant information is, the mean fraud risk assessment level is much higher, which shows that they are susceptible to the dilution effect because they've rated the fraud risk as much higher. Whereas in the expert system condition, actually, so because it's a within subject study, the relevant and irrelevant information condition, we see they actually revised their fraud risk assessments to be lower to 4.13. I think it's interesting, and I think the authors mentioned in this paper that the standard deviation we see is higher without the expert system and much lower with the expert system, which shows there should be some kind of learning going on because their estimates are converging closer towards the mean. And these are the actual results. The authors showed that in their hypotheses, all of these using an F-test are highly significant. The p-values are all very low, like they're less than 1%. So their hypotheses should be, or it shows that all of them are highly significant. And finally, the authors also go through a verbal protocol analysis to dig a little bit deeper into basically why do we have the dilution effect, and then how does the expert system actually help. So they showed that the method was developed within reference to these authors here, Erickson and Simon and Chi, and the Biggs and Mock. Their coding was very consistent with the Biggs and Mock internal control assessment, which again is something that auditors do. So I think the coding should be very, I think like we would believe that because it's close to internal control assessment. We assume it's pretty close to fraud risk assessment. And the authors found that the relevant case verbalized more plan operators. So it shows that they thought more about how to approach the audit. The irrelevant and relevant information participants spent less effort to actually acquire information and had a narrow focus, which was interesting because they were actually, they actually had more information, but they didn't really, I guess, spend time to think a little bit more about the information that they had. And the relevant info participants made more inferences, and the irrelevant and relevant info participants spent more time assessing the risk factors, which is expected because, again, they had 10 as compared to the other case where there was 6. So they also showed, I guess the summary overall here of the relevant versus the irrelevant and relevant participants is that it seems like the relevant participants spent more time on analytical thinking and then actually planning the audit, while the irrelevant and relevant information participants were overloaded with the information and spent most of the time just processing that information, I guess, but at a very, or at a more basic level than the only relevant info participants. The authors also found that irrelevant and relevant info participants were fixated on management integrity and focused more on non-financial factors, which seem to, when compared with the expert panel, like the managers and partners seem to focus more on the financial information, which was maybe why the dilution effect occurred. So going back to the 3 questions I had before, and then the authors answered them. Does the dilution effect affect fraud risk assessment specifically? Yes, for less experienced auditors. When does it take effect? When there are a large number of possible cues to attend to, and particularly a focus on the non-financial information. This was basically the findings of the 2x2 experiment itself and also the verbal protocol analysis. And are there ways to mitigate it? So the results through the expert system shows that there might be some ways to mitigate it, which actually comes to my last slide. So some questions I had were how I think it could be investigated a little bit more about how the expert system actually influences judgment. I think the results are very enlightening, I guess, that after using the expert system, actually the relevant and irrelevant information participants, the ones who experienced the dilution effect, did converge their answers closer to what the expert panel did. But I think it would be interesting to see a little bit more information on how the actual thought process works and how they actually come to that closer to the expert panel judgment. Also, I think you mentioned in the 2x2 design study, there should be 60 to 80 participants, right? So here there was only 46. I guess it was probably because it's just very hard to access some Odyssey.
No, that's not one.
No?
Because it's not really a 2 by 2. Right?
Oh, really?
It's because it's a within subjects design. So you've only manipulated, a 2 by 2 assumes you've manipulated 2 variables, right?
Okay.
2 different variables.
Okay.
So what we only manipulated 1 variable, right? So the one variable we manipulated was relevant versus relevant and irrelevant information. And each participant participated in the expert system. So we measured their responses at time 1 without the expert system and time 2 with the expert system. So each participant, so when you have a within subjects design, right, that means that every participant, regardless of the condition they're in, are going to perform some judgment at time 2. They're going to perform a judgment at time 1 and a judgment at time 2. So I know it kind of seems like we had because each participant participated in both time 1 and time 2, we didn't manipulate. That's not really a manipulation. We're measuring their responses using. So we don't have so each participant serves as their own control actually, right? Because then we have their decision at time 1 and we have their decision at time 2.
Okay.
So that's why you see that we have less subjects, because we really are not. I know it seems like we're manipulating, but in the sense of manipulating, that would mean that some people got the expert system and some people didn't. So if we had done that, where some people got an expert system and some people didn't get an expert system, then you're right, we would be a 2 by 2 and we would need 60 to 80. But everybody got the expert system. It's just that we measured it at 2 different points, one before and one after.
So if participants serve as their own control, then that's not really called manipulation.
Right, we didn't because they're serving as their own control. Everybody's answering. So manipulation assumes that you put people in different buckets, right? Right. So we really only have we have a fraud judgment that occurs at time 1 and time 2, and every participant performs that time 1, time 2 fraud judgment assessment.
Okay.
And so I want to talk about, you raised a very good point about how the expert system actually influences judgment, and that's a part of why we were doing the verbal protocol as well.
Right.
So with the verbal protocol, what we were interested in is what is it that, so we already know, right, that inexperienced people are more susceptible to the dilution effect. And so what is it, even though they know that it's irrelevant information, what is it about that are there some characteristics of the irrelevant information in this that makes them incorporated? So we're trying to, see that, what can we kind of get some feeling about what's going on, and so that's what you discussed before. But the next step in this, because this is still, we're trying to get this paper finalized so we can submit it in the next couple of months, is we're now looking at the verbal protocol and say, what is it about the expert system that changed them, right? We want to show, here's how the expert system, caused them to refocus, right? Changed how they approach judging it. We want to show that it's not just merely that they're seeing it again, right? It's the fact that the expert system is causing them to rethink or focus more on SAS 99. So we're in the process now of analyzing the verbal protocols when they're in the expert system. That should help us to talk about how the expert, we didn't want to just say that the expert system mitigated, we wanted to provide some context around what it is about the expert system that led them to no longer be susceptible to the dilution effect.
Right, yeah, so I guess one way, another thing I'm interested in is in the verbal protocol analysis, we saw that why the less experienced auditors actually focus more on the non-financial information, whereas experienced auditors focus more on the financial information. I was wondering if we could test that and then see if that's the main contributing factor to the dilution effect. And I think that's about it. I think the authors mentioned that the within subjects design might also be part part of a weakness to the study, because of course within subjects there might be demand effects. I think the authors did do some tests for the demand effects, but of course it's always a concern.
Right, and so, and that's within subjects, and in designing an experiment within subjects, you have to be really careful about the possibility of demand effects, and with any experimental design, but it's certainly within subjects design, because you want to be able to say concretely that no, it's the independent variables that's driving the outcome. It's what we manipulated or measured that's driving the outcome, not that they were able to figure out what our hypothesis was, right? And that's what demand effects create. So there's no way they can figure out what our hypothesis, you know, that the expert system will mitigate it. So we run some sensitivity analysis to show that we don't think, that we believe, we're pretty confident that there were no demand effects as a result of this within subjects design.
And I think that's it in my presentation. Thank you.